Vážené dámy, vážení páni, priatelia a študenti slobodnej spoločnosti. Moje meno je Gonda a za Konzervatívny inštitút Štefánika vás vítam na ďalšej prednáške v rámci nášho programu Konzervatívny Economic Quarterly Lecture Series, ktorý sa v tomto mesiaci dožíva 20 rokov a v roku 2009 bol ocenený Templeton Freedom Award v kategórii Etika a hodnot. Ani dnešnú prednášku by sme nemohli zorganizovať bez pomoci a spolupráce partnerov. Preto hneď na úvod chcem poďakovať v prvom rade nadácii Štefánika, ale aj ďalším partnerom, a to softwarovej spoločnosti Gratex International, bezpečnostnej spoločnosti v oblasti informačných technológií Tempa, spoločnosti obchodujúcej s cennými papiermi European Investment Center, advokátskej kancelárii MST Partners, konzultačnej firme Looking East EU, Slovenskej asociácie finančníkov, Slovak Students for Liberty, týždenníkom Týždeň a Trend, internetovému spravodajskému webu Aktuality.sk, slovenskej tlačovej agentúre SITA a internetovému denníku Energie Portál. Dnes môžeme privítať medzi nami na najvyš vzácneho hostia. Je ním Lord Matt Ridley, ktorý sa zameriava predovšetkým na ekonomické, biologické a environmentálne súvislosti spontánneho fungovania a napredovania spoločnosti a sveta. Opiera sa pritom napríklad o myšlienky autora ekonomickej a spoločenskej evolúcie Adama Smitha, ktorý je tu s nami symbolicky na mojej kravate, a tiež o autora biologickej evolúcie Charlesa Darwina, ktorý sa inšpiroval aj Adamom Smithom. Som presvedčený, že jeho argumentmi a faktami podložený racionálny optimizmus s optikou študenta spoločnosti je dnes veľmi potrebný. Totiž silnejú hlasy rôznych spoločenských dizajnerov, alarmistov a populistov, ktoré môžu podkopať základy dnešnej spoločnosti. A preto dnes nám príde prednášať o dôležitej téme expert na slovo vzatý. Predtým, ako mu odovzdám slovo, by som chcel povedať ešte niekoľko vied z jeho životopisu. Lord Matt Ridley je britský popularizátor vedy, publicista, podnikateľ a autor mnohých kníh, ktoré boli preložené aj do češtiny, čo o chvíľu aj spomeniem. Bol napríklad vedeckým editorom týždenníka The Economist a tiež bol v rokoch 2013 až 2021 členom snemovne lordov. Je autorom viacerých knižných bestsellerov. Boli predané viac ako miliónov vytlačkov a preložené do 31 jazykov. Vy viacerí z vás poznáte jeho knihy v češtine. 6 kníh bolo preložených do češtiny. A v dnešnej prednáške sa bude opierať najmä o 2 knihy. A na tie vás chcem aj upozorniť osobitne. Prvou knihou je The Rational Optimist. V češtine vyšla kniha pod názvom Racionálny optimista o evolúcii prosperity a za ňu získal niekoľko ocenení. A The Economist na margo tejto knihy uviedol, že je určitým spôsobom slávnym potomkom, ktorý by vznikol, keby sa myšlienky Charlesa Darwina spojili s myšlienkami Adama Smitha. A to ešte vo svojej ďalšej knihe, ktorú chcem spomenúť, The Evolution of Everything, evolúcia všeho, tak v tej išiel hlbšie ešte do podstaty fungovania slobodnej spoločnosti alebo celkovo spoločnosti a sveta. A ako upozornil profesor Alberto Mingardi, Ridley sa v nej zameriava viac na ľudské interpretácie sveta, v ktorom žijeme, teda hlavne na myšlienky, na množiace sa myšlienky. Napríklad vo svojej prednáške Ako myšlienky majú sex získal takú popularitu na webe, na videa, ktorú zliadlo v súčasnosti viac ako 2,5 milióna ľudí. A my dnes máme vzácnu príležitosť si vypočuť nášho hostia, experta na problematiku ekonomickej evolúcie, celkovej evolúcie, inovácií práve o týchto problémoch tu v Bratislave. Ja verím, že máte stíšené alebo vypnuté vaše mobilné telefóny, aby sme neboli rušení pri jeho prednáške. A teraz už odostávam slovo Lordovi Ridleymu, aby prezentoval svoju prednášku. Dear Lord, floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, very much indeed for that very kind introduction, and I am very honoured to be here in Slovakia for the first time in my life. What a wonderful city this is, and what beautiful weather you have here in Bratislava. I am not an economist, I am not an academic, so I don't know as much as some of you probably do about the world. I'm a writer, but what I try to write about is evolution. I was an evolutionary biologist before I was a writer, and I'm very struck by how the prosperity of the modern world is an evolutionary phenomenon. It emerges through the interactions of people in the same way that biological evolution evolves. And that's the parallel that has fascinated me for many years. And I want to start with an object which sits on my desk at home. It is an Ashwalian hand axe from about 500,000 years ago, probably made by Homo erectus. And next to it sits an object of exactly the same size and shape. And when I first noticed the similarity between these two, it was a very exciting moment for me, because here are two objects both designed to fit the human hand, but 500,000 years apart, and in that one image you see the entire progress of technology for humankind. But it's the differences between the two objects that intrigue me most, because the axe was made by one person out of one substance for himself or herself. The mouse was made for me, I bought it, by other people, and made from lots of different substances, and embodying lots of different ideas. The idea of silicon, the idea of plastic, the idea of computing, the idea of a mouse. These ideas occurred to different people in different times, in different places, but they came together cumulatively in this one object. And for me, that is the secret to understanding human progress, human prosperity, and human technology. We work in a collaborative way, and we combine and recombine the products of our own minds. And what enables us to do this, of course, is a division of labour, the fact that I do what I'm good at, you do what you're good at, and we share the the results. And this is not unique to human beings. Other animals have division of labor. The social insects, ants and bees, also have a division of labor. This is a photograph of a worker ant and a soldier ant from the same species, one very small and one very large, and they are sharing out the duties in the nest. But unlike us, they are fixed in their roles. You can't change from a soldier to a worker. Whereas we are constantly changing the role we play in the division of labor. And we even have invented a division of labor between species. So a shepherd with a dog looking after sheep, there is a division of labor between 3 different species in this photograph, the man, the dog, and the sheep. And this division of labor goes very deep in human history. It looks as if we started with a sexual division of labor a very long time ago. And what I mean by that is that if you look at foraging societies, hunter-gatherer societies, wherever you look at them, you always find a different role for men and women. On the whole, men are hunting, women are gathering. They both provide food. Sometimes the women provide more food than the men, sometimes the men provide more food than the women, but where there is hunting, men do most of it. Where there is gathering, women do most of it. In the Hadza in Tanzania, the men go out to hunt animals, the women dig for roots. And this is a very good system economically because you get the reliable protein, you get the reliable carbohydrates from the gathering, and you get the high quality protein from the hunting, and both of them reduce the risk of doing the other. So you're reducing the risk of doing this. And this seems to be a very ancient habit of humans. And I think it's possible that this is what got us into the habit of exchange and specialization. Got us into the idea that we should do one thing well and get other people to do other things and then bring them together. Because there is also evidence that trade goes very deep in human history. Trade is probably 10 times as old as agriculture. Wherever hunter-gatherer societies are contacted for the first time, they are very well aware of the possibilities of trade. They immediately understand that there's a give and take. And the beads on the right are objects found probably used as jewelry or maybe as currency inland in North Africa, more than 100 miles, from about 100,000 years ago. And what that suggests is that objects were already moving long distances. It's a signature of trade that objects move long distances. People didn't travel 100 miles to the sea to collect seashells and then go back again. They got them from their neighbors, who got them from their neighbors, and so on. But trade implies a division of labor, a habit of exchange and specialization. And so this 100,000 years is long enough to have left a mark on our genes, to have made us instinctively good at some of these calculations, some of these ideas about exchange and specialization. And interestingly, it looks as if, but we don't have a huge amount of evidence here, this was something that our cousins, the Neanderthals, did not do. The Neanderthal brains were as big as human ones, maybe bigger in some cases, but there is no evidence of them trading. There is no evidence of them getting objects from a long way away. To give just one example, at a place called Ortvala Klidi, there is 99.6% of the Neanderthal material is made from local stone, whereas when modern humans replaced Neanderthals at this site, between 5 and 7% of their tools were made from obsidian and had come from a long way away. So I think this probably is what gave us our edge over the Neanderthals, because we were able not only to get materials from a long way away, but to get ideas from a long way away. exchange and specialization effectively gives us a large collective brain as large as the population we're in contact with. And the habit of exchange, of swapping things, is very deep in our natures. Children love doing it from a very early age. All human beings do it, and they enjoy doing it. And it's very hard to persuade a chimpanzee to do it. There's been several experiments to give them the idea, look, you've got all the carrots, he's got all the grapes, why don't you do a deal? They just don't get it. I mean, you don't obviously do it, tell them in English, you sort of give them incentives. But so it seems to be something that's in our nature to enjoy exchange. Adam Smith saw this. He said, no man ever saw a dog make fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog. He thought that this was a human characteristic. And the consequence of it, I think, is that it is the root of our prosperity, because it produces this extraordinary 2 + 2 = 5 equation, whereby there are gains from trade through specialization and exchange. And to show you what I mean, I'm going to retell the law of David Ricardo's law of comparative advantage, but in Stone Age terms. There are two people. Adam takes 4 hours to make a spear and 3 hours to make an axe. Oz takes 1 hour to make a spear and 2 hours to make an axe. So Oz is better at spears than axes. Adam is better at axes than spears. But Oz is better than Adam at both spears and axes. So Oz doesn't need Adam. Adam is a waste of space. He can forget about Adam and make his tools and go off hunting. Well, no, because if Adam makes 2 spears, that's 6 hours instead of 7. And if Adam makes 2 axes, and if Oz makes 2 spears, that's 2 hours instead of 3. So they've both saved an hour of work if they don't trade. And that is the extraordinary product of exchange and specialization, the benefit that can come from it. And we harvest that all the time in our lives today, I believe. If you look at fishing tackle used by people in the Pacific, you find that islands with more sophisticated fishing tackle have either larger populations or more connections to other islands close by, more trading connections. There is a clear correlation between the number of people you're in contact with and the sophistication of your technology. And when you think about it, the great theme of our civilization, if you like, is that we specialize in production but diversify in consumption. We get more and more narrow in what we produce. We call it a job. And we get more and more wide in what we can consume. And that's what lies behind really the whole story of economic progress, in my view. This is clearly shown in one interesting case history where you can compare what happened to the people of Tasmania with the people of Tierra del Fuego since the last ice age. Tasmania became an island about 10,000 years ago when the sea level rose at the end of the ice age, and the people of that island were then isolated for nearly 10,000 years, about 4,000 people on the island. And not only did they not get access to the technologies that were developed after that point, like the boomerang, which was invented after that in mainland Australia, but they actually reduced the complexity of their technology. They gave up certain tools. They simplified their toolkit because there were only 4,000 of them and it was too small a collective brain to sustain the technology they already had. The same did not happen on Tierra del Fuego, a similar island, similar size, similar population of people. They got access to the bow and arrow during the last 10,000 years, for example. Their technology became more and more sophisticated. Why? Because the Magellan Strait is quite narrow, the Bass Strait is very wide, and so there was trading contact between Tierra del Fuego and South America throughout this period. There's a, I think, wonderful essay. Many of you will know it already. It's called I, Pencil, written by Leonard Read. It was often quoted by Milton Friedman. And I think it contains a vital insight into the way the world works. It's written by a pencil. And the pencil is trying to understand how it came into existence. And it's researching who made it. And it finds that the wood came from forests, and the lead came from graphite mines, and it was put together in a factory, and there were people cutting down trees and people mining graphite, and they were drinking coffee, and the people were growing coffee for them to drink, and such. It finds more and more and more people were contributing to the making of one pencil. Probably millions of people contribute to the making of a single pencil, just a very simple object. But, and this is the punchline of the story, and I'm sorry to spoil it for you, not one of these million people knows how to make a pencil. The person working in the pencil factory doesn't know how to make a pencil. They just know how to do their job because they don't know how to cut down a tree or to mine graphite. When you think about it, the knowledge of how to make even the simplest objects in our worlds does not exist inside human heads. It exists between and among human heads. This is why I think the idea of collective intelligence is critical to understanding what we do as a species and what we achieve. And here is where the word sex has to come in. Because in biological evolution, sexual reproduction plays a critical role. It brings together different lineages. It brings together mutations or innovations that occur in different families and allows them to come together. So, for example, there are animals in the world that have feathers, and there are animals in the world that can produce milk. Birds produce feathers, mammals produce milk, but because birds can't sexually reproduce with mammals, you can't ever get an animal with feathers that also produces milk. That would be a great innovation to produce. And as you can see from this very simple diagram, in an asexual species without sex, you end up with separate innovations in separate lineages. Sex brings them together, it combines and recombines them. And so when I say human prosperity derives from ideas having sex, and in a very literal sense, that exchange is playing the same role in human innovation as sexual reproduction is playing in human or animal evolution. My favourite example of this, of ideas having sex, is the pill camera. It's a technology where you swallow a pill and it films your insides as it goes through. I don't think it's a very successful innovation, but it's a rather ingenious one. And it came about after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. That's the sort of thing I mean when I say ideas having sex. And it is absolutely fundamental to innovation, because most of the innovation that happens in the world to this day consists of combining and recombining existing things. It doesn't really consist of coming up with totally new objects and materials. And the consequence of all this is prosperity. We end up working for each other and raising each other's living standards. Louis XIV was the wealthiest man in the world of his day, probably. He had 498 people to prepare his dinner every night. I don't know why he didn't round it up to 500, but that's what apparently he had. And that's what made him so rich, having so many people working for him. But hang on, each and every one of you has 498 people preparing your dinner tonight. They're in bistros and cafes and restaurants around town, and none of them knows who's going to feed you yet, but at an hour's notice, they will produce a very good meal for you this evening. They are working for you. They're also working for other people, and you're going to work for them because you're going to give them some of your earnings to support them. So the working for each other feels to me like the way in which we raise each other's living standards. Now, to get across just how spectacular the last 200 years, and indeed the last 50 years, and indeed the last 20 years have been for the human race, it's worth asking a very simple question, which Hans Rosling asked about 1,000 Americans before he died, and it has since been repeated, this question, with other nations. And you get a very similar answer. In the last 20 years, has the percentage of the world that lives in extreme poverty, by which we basically mean $2 a day, has that percentage doubled, halved, or stayed the same? And the answer you get from people is that about 65% of people think it has doubled. They think the world is getting poorer, and the percentage of the world that lives in extreme poverty is going up. Only 5% think it's halved. The 5% are right, the 65% are wrong. But it's more interesting than that, because Hans Rosling pointed out that if he wrote those 3 answers on 3 bananas and put them in a cage with a monkey in it, the monkey would pick up the correct answer to that question 33% of the time. So it would do 6 times as well as human beings in answering a question about human society. How can that be? How come monkeys know more about our prosperity than we do? The answer was rather well put by a 19th century sage, Josh Billings, who said, "It's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that ain't so." We are actively ignorant about the world we live in. We don't understand just how spectacular the changes have been in our living standards as a result of technology and innovation. Here's the graph of world population and the percentage of it that lives in extreme poverty. And as you can see, I have lived through an unprecedented transformation in the prospects of poor people. Nobody has ever seen such a change in poverty in their lifetime as my generation, going from over 50% of people living on $2 a day to less than 10% now. It's an extraordinary feat, and it's happened while the population itself has been growing very rapidly. And nobody thought it was even possible. I mean, this is what the experts said in 1992 about the future, 35 years ago. Humanity stands at a defining moment in history. We are confronted with a perpetuation of disparities between and within nations, a worsening of poverty, hunger, ill health, and illiteracy. That's in the preamble to Agenda 21 from the Rio Conference in 1992. Well, actually, global equality has gone down very fast in this time, because people in poor countries have been getting rich faster than people in rich countries. Poverty has not got worse, it's got better. Hunger has gotten much better. There is very little famine now in the world compared with what was going on then. And most ill health has declined, and so has illiteracy. Just to show you the data on famine, the number of people dying each decade of famine was very variable in the 20th century. Perhaps you could argue that it was going up, but since the 1970s, famine has effectively gone extinct. Almost nobody dies of famine these days. That is extraordinary when you think there are 8 billion of us. And Paul Ehrlich wrote a best-selling book called The Population Bomb in 1968 and said, in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. Now, I think it's really interesting to understand how and why this happened and why it happened to us and not to rabbits or rocks. I was going to talk about aviation safety, but there's been a terrible plane crash today in India, so I won't. Sorry, that wasn't meant to be funny. I literally, just think that. But it's an example of huge improvement in one of the risks we face. And of course, the source of this improvement in our living standards is technological innovation. And to illustrate just what that can do for us, there's a rather wonderful chart here, produced by some economists, arguing what the price of light was, the price of artificial light back to 1301. Now, I don't think that data is very reliable for the early years, but still, they've made an estimate of how much it cost you to buy light, to buy 1 million lumen hours, which is not an awful lot of light, and it was very, very expensive for most of history. And then it became very, very cheap. But that's in money. If you measure it instead in the critical measure, which is time, how long do you have to work on the average wage to earn enough light to read a book for an hour, preferably my book? And that's about 1,200 lumen hours. And today, on the average US wage, you would have to work for about 1/5 of a second to earn that much light. So it's a pretty good bargain. Your grandparents had to work for 8 seconds, 40 times as long. That's really quite a significant difference, but it's still not a huge expenditure of time to get light. 1880, with kerosene lamps and the then average wage, 15 minutes of work for 1 hour of light. And in 1800, with a tallow candle, 6 hours of work for 1 hour of light. Most people could not afford a candle. In 1800, most people did not have any artificial light at all in their homes, except what came from the fire in the hearth. Light has gone from being an expensive luxury to a necessity that we all feel that we have a right to, and that everybody can afford. Now, what is innovation, and how does it work? And I'm just going to run through some themes that I think emerge from a study of innovation, and that are in my book, How Innovation Works. It's a much more gradual process than we think. We tend to think of brilliant inventors coming up with major disruptive inventions, whether it's ChatGPT or something like that, and suddenly the world is different. But actually there's always a process of gradual improvement leading up to that, and then gradual improvement after the breakthrough. This is Moore's law, the steady improvement in the cost of computing over time. And as you can see, it applies not just to the integrated circuit, but to the technologies that preceded it. So the switch from vacuum tubes to transistors was not a step change. It was a gradual improvement. The last vacuum tube was about as good as the first transistor. So it's a much more gradual process than we tend to think. We give someone a prize or a patent when they invent something, but actually we should remember that it's a process of emergence. It's evolutionary. You can trace family trees of our everyday objects in the same way that you can with species. So the mobile phone evolved into a smaller device and then back into a bigger device. Who knew? But that's the path dependence of the mobile phone's descent with modification, to use the Darwinian term. It is Darwinian in the sense that there is competition between mutations for survival in our technologies. And a French philosopher, Alain, put it rather beautifully. He said, every boat is copied from another boat. Let's reason as follows in the manner of Darwin. It's clear that a very badly made boat will end up at the bottom after 1 or 2 voyages and thus never be copied. One could then say with complete rigor that it is the sea herself who fashions the boats, choosing those which function and destroying the others. I think that's rather a beautiful way of looking at it, and it makes it clear that it's a bottom-up process. It's not really a design process from the top down. Designers come up with lots of different ideas, some survive and some don't. Evolution works by experimentation, and so does innovation. If you talk to innovators, they always stress the importance of trial and error, of swinging and missing, as Jeff Bezos likes to put it. Thomas Edison famously said, "I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work." And what Edison did when he was trying to perfect his light bulb was he tried many different types of plant material to make the filament of the light bulb. And he tested 6,000 different types of plant before he settled on one kind of Japanese bamboo. He was a perfectionist in that sense, but he knew the importance of just not knowing the answer, not knowing where you were going, just trying everything until you happen upon something that is better. Talking of light bulbs, there is a rather fascinating phenomenon that I still don't fully understand, which is called simultaneous invention. Kevin Kelly writes about it in his book, What Technology Wants. 21 different people invented the light bulb independently around the same time in the 1870s. There was Edison in North America, there was Swan in England, there was Lodygin in Russia, and so on. And why is this? I mean, did the Almighty suddenly put his hand down from the clouds and inject the idea of light bulbs into 21 different brains? No. What's happening here is that the technology was ripe. It was ready to go. We had reached the point where the preceding technologies, glass blowing, vacuum pumps, electricity, etc., they could all have sex and produce this baby called the light bulb. And so it doesn't matter whether Edison and Swan and Lodygin get run over by a tram or something else. You still get light bulbs, whatever happens to the individual. They are dispensable, in a sense, because it's so inevitable, inexorable, that light bulbs will emerge. A more recent and modern example is the search engine. When the internet came into existence around 1990, it was inevitable that people would invent search engines, and it was probably inevitable that someone would make an awful lot of money out of search engines. Google happened to be the one that scooped the pool, but there were lots of other rival search engines at the time. If Sergey Brin had never met Larry Page, we'd still have search engines. Probably the most useful invention of my lifetime, by the way. I struggle to remember how I survived without search engines. I use them every day. But the weird thing here is that nobody saw it coming. If you go and read what people are saying about the internet in the 1980s, almost nobody predicts the importance of search. Larry Page and Sergey Brin did not even actually think they were inventing a search engine. They thought they were cataloging the internet, and they only stumbled upon the fact that they had discovered a gold mine quite late on in the process. So, looking backwards, innovation can look very predictable. Looking forwards, we don't seem to be able to predict it, and I find that really intriguing. It's serendipitous. People often set off to invent one thing and they invent something else. The post-it note, the yellow sticky paper thing, was invented by Art Fry at 3M. He was looking for a permanent glue that worked with paper. He found a temporary glue that worked with paper, and he thought, well, that's a waste of time. And then he remembered he was going to choir practice that evening, and he wanted to mark his place in his book. Stephanie Kwolek invented Kevlar, bulletproof vests. That was not what she was trying to do at all. She was trying to do something else. I can't even remember what it was, but at DuPont. So people often stumble upon things unexpectedly in innovation. And probably the neatest example of innovation done well and innovation done badly, in my view, is what happened in 1903 in America. A very clever man, whose name has suddenly escaped me, Samuel Langley, who was the head of the Smithsonian Institution and a brilliant astrophysicist, got a huge grant from the American government to build the first aeroplane. $25,000, a lot of money in those days. And because he was so clever, he didn't need to consult anybody else, so he did the whole thing in secret. And then he announced that he was going to fly this plane, or get somebody else to fly this plane, off the off the roof of a boat on the Potomac River in October 1903. And as you can see from this photograph taken at the time, it plunged straight into the water. Langley was humiliated, the US government was furious, and the whole thing was a fiasco. 8 weeks later, on an island off North Carolina, 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, without a degree between them, succeeded where Langley had failed, the Wright brothers. And what they had done right that Langley had done wrong is that they did not think they were the cleverest people in the room. They had picked the brains of other people all over the world. Otto Lilienthal in Germany, Octave Chanute in Chicago, people in Australia, people working with kites and box kites and gliders and wind tunnels. They had harvested ideas from everywhere around the world through correspondence. And then they had done a ton of experiments with gliders before they ever went near putting an engine on a plane. So they did trial and error. They didn't think they knew the answer. They just found it out gradually, bit by bit. It's a very good example, I think, of how innovation does work and how innovation doesn't work. And it's quite important, in my view, to remember that innovation is more than just inventing something new. It's often a case of making something affordable and reliable. There is a nice story that Charles Towns, the inventor of the laser, used to tell about a beaver talking to a rabbit at the Hoover Dam. And the beaver says to the rabbit, "No, I didn't build it, but it is based on an idea of mine." And too often you will find, particularly scientists in academia, saying, "It's very unfair, I had that idea and somebody else has made a fortune out of it." Yes, but actually getting from the prototype to the practical, reliable and usable version is often more work, an awful lot more work than coming up with the idea in the first place. You tend not to get a statue or a Nobel Prize for doing that, but someone like Jeff Bezos, who brought us e-commerce more than anybody else in the 1990s, he wasn't an inventor, but he was an innovator in the sense of driving down the price and driving up the reliability of a new product. Now, I mentioned that you can look back at innovations and see them as predictable, but you can't see them coming in advance. And it is very striking how bad experts are at predicting what is going to happen in technology. Ken Olsen was the chairman of the Digital Equipment Corporation, which made the smallest computers of the time, very successful business, and he said in 1977, there's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, brilliant man, 1998 said by 2005 it'll become clear that the internet's impact on the economy is no greater than the fax machines. Steve Ballmer, the chief executive of Microsoft in 2007 said, there's no chance the iPhone's going to get any market share, no chance. Very clever people say very stupid things about the future. And what that tells me is not that they're stupid, but that the future is often genuinely unknowable. And so when people say to me, right, okay, you know, what's coming next? How successful is AI going to be? You know, what is gene editing going to do for medicine? I try and say, I don't know. And you'd be stupid to print anything I say. This is an image of the future from the year I was born. It's predicting what the year 2000 will look like. And it shows a postman delivering ordinary letters, but with a rocket strapped to his back. And of course what they're doing is predicting too much progress in transport technologies, but too little progress in information technologies. Because the first half of the 20th century was all about planes and cars and rockets, but no change really in information technologies. The second half of the century was the opposite. We had more cup holders in cars. We had jets that went the same speed for 50 years. In fact, they go slightly slower these days. But we had spectacular changes in information technology. So not all technologies go at the same speed. And I think when today we say, oh, we're going to see incredible digital technologies for the next few decades, maybe not. Maybe that phase is over. Maybe the next 50 years will all be about biomedicine or something like that. But as I say, don't believe a word I say about the future. Not everybody gets the future wrong. This is a German cartoon from the 1920s showing how we'll spend the future, and it's a pretty accurate picture of what we do today, I think. One way to understand this, I think, is a superb remark that a man named Roy O'Mara made in the 1960s. He said, we underestimate the impact of a new technology in the long run, but we overestimate it in the short run. So we expect AI to transform our world, and then it disappoints for a long time, and then suddenly it does change the world. So I would argue that it's not linear, it's S-shaped how we adopt technologies. The internet is no longer disappointing, I think, despite what Paul Krugman said. Genomics was disappointing for a while, but is now beginning to deliver. Well, I made this chart a while ago, maybe it's moved a little further up the curve, and crypto and things like that has hardly begun to disappoint us yet, but that doesn't mean you should write it off in the future. I'm going to skip through that one. One of the things that emerges is that big companies are bad at innovation. Kodak was blown away by digital photography, Nokia was blown away by data on phones as opposed to voice phones. They knew these technologies were coming, but they couldn't do anything about it. They were like rabbits in the headlights. They couldn't cannibalize their own business. They couldn't destroy their own monopolies quickly enough. And on the whole, it is small startups which produce innovations. It's outsiders. And that is an important lesson, I think, for politicians, is that you need to encourage small businesses as well as big businesses. Empires are bad at innovation too. And they ought to be great at innovation. They're huge free trade zones, after all, with lots of ideas meeting and mating. But in fact, they're very centralized in their policies, they're very top-down, and they tend to be driven by bureaucrats telling people what to do, so they don't do much. On the whole, the general lesson that I've learnt from studying innovation is that it requires freedom. The freedom to experiment, trial and error, the freedom to fail, the freedom to collaborate, to change direction, to back your ideas, to invest, to act fast. And you know, when people say to me, yes, but China's very innovative and it's not a free country. Well, politically it's not a free country at all. But economically it has been a free country until very recently. Under the Deng Xiaoping reforms, it was effectively a very free place for entrepreneurs to get off the ground and do all these things without bothering with much regulation, as long as you didn't invent a rival to the Communist Party, obviously. I do think that is the secret source of human innovation, is not to predict and promote particular innovations, but to liberate people to go out and discover through trial and error what the answer is. Innovation is often unpopular. Look at the way genetically modified crops were kept out of Europe for an entire generation. It always has been, actually. This is an article in the New York Times saying something ought to be done to Mr. Edison, and there is a growing conviction that it had better be done with a hemp rope. Mr. Edison has invented too many things, and almost without exception they are things of the most deleterious character. People don't like innovation when it happens. So what will technology look like in 2050? I don't know. But it could see extraordinary improvements in generative AI, cancer vaccines, blockchain, life extension, fusion power. But it's got to overcome all sorts of obstacles that we put in the way of innovators. Crony capitalism, whereby big companies prevent small companies innovating, regulation, the picking of losers. When governments think they're picking winners, they often champion losers. the precautionary principle, which says never do anything for the first time, and a general distrust of the view, which is quite common. But the potential is extraordinary. These are the prognoses for the world economy produced for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change under 5 different scenarios. And they're probably not worth the paper they're written on, in terms, like most economic models, but they just show what could be done. SSP5, the orange one, has the average person on planet Earth 10 times as rich in 2100 as they are today. Just think about that for a second. Think what you could do if everyone was 10 times as rich. Every African, every Asian. Think how much money you could afford for social justice, for environmental improvements, all that kind of thing. It's an amazing opportunity. And if you read the descriptions of these scenarios, SSP5 is the one where there is a ferment of innovation because there is free trade, free enterprise. They say that, and then they go on to say, but it's a very bad scenario because it produces a lot of emissions. Well, if we're 10 times as rich, then we can probably learn how to cope with and reduce those emissions. So there is, even those who don't think economic growth is a good thing are admitting that liberating people to go out and innovate could give our grandchildren a fantastic future. That's what world average GDP per capita has done since 1600, with an extraordinary acceleration. And even in 1830, Macaulay was saying that he was fed up with the pessimists saying it can't go on. We cannot absolutely prove that those are in error who say society has reached a turning point, that we have seen our best days, but so said all who came before us, and with just as much apparent reason. On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? And today, everyone is gloomy about the future, and they're almost certainly wrong. The end.
Interesting presentation. Now is time for discussion. Takže ako viete, teraz prichádza ten čas, kde aj príležitosť pre vás. Kto máte záujem, môžete sa prihlásiť. Pevne verím, že ste si premysleli už nejaké otázky. Podľa môjho pokynu príde v ruke nášho asistenta mikrofón k vám. Povedzte, v akom jazyku sa spýtate, alebo poviete svoju pripomienku, aby sme vedeli pripraviť tlmočenie. A poprosím vás rešpektovať, využiť čas 2 minút, aby ostalo naozaj na čo najviac vás. Takže nech sa páči, kto má záujem v strede. Mikrofón putuje.
Dobrý deň, opýtam sa po slovensky a budem vychádzať z toho záveru, ktorý mňa osobne veľmi trápi už dlhší čas. A to je tento pesimizmus, ktorý ale najhoršie vplýva na mladých ľudí. Mladí ľudia nevidia pred sebou perspektívu, čo, ako to vy vidíte. Čo v tomto smere sa dá robiť?
Well, part of my, the reason for writing the book, The reason for writing The Rational Optimist, partly for me, was because I remembered how pessimistic I was when I was a young person. Because I don't remember an adult saying anything optimistic about the future at all to me in the 1970s. They told me the population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, pollution was going to shorten my lifespan, the desert was advancing, acid rain was killing the forests, etc., etc. And of course, sometime later they said because the computers couldn't cope with the change of date in 1999, the entire world was going to grind to a halt with the Y2K bug. This litany of doom and gloom, I was so cross, so angry when I learned that it was wrong, after 20 years, and I realized actually the world is getting better, not worse, that I wanted to celebrate that fact and tell young people about it. But I need to keep reminding, I'm now quite pessimistic again. I find myself getting very angry with the failure to adopt good policies, I'm really concerned that pessimism could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And particularly living in Europe, one sees that. There's just a lack of ambition about innovation in this continent. And I include Britain in that very much so. That is very worrying. And my real worry is not that my grandchildren are going to be very poorer than me. I don't think so. I think they're going to be richer than me. But they're not going to be nearly as rich as they could be if we had better policies. And that's the argument I want to try and win next.
Thank you very much. Kto další? V prvom rade, nech sa páči.
Thank you for interesting presentation. This will be in English. You mentioned there that empires are really bad in innovation. Is US empire? Is China empire? How come China was really successful in thousands of years and then became very unsuccessful? It doesn't make sense to me.
Well, to take China, China went through periods of being very successful and then periods of being very unsuccessful. So the Song Empire, around 1,000 years ago, was an incredible time of innovation and prosperity. That's when you get the magnetic compass and the paper money and movable block printing and lots, the canal lock, all sorts of innovations from that period. And it became a very, very prosperous society for the time. Very ample food for people, etc., etc. Then there was the Mongol invasion, which destroyed all that, and then comes the Ming Empire. And under the Ming Empire, China becomes an impoverished, desperate place with people's living standards plummeting. What's the difference between those two, the Song and the Ming? And the answer is that the Song was a very decentralized empire, very devolved empire. The cities were run by merchants. The central bureaucracy was not very powerful. And basically, people were left to get on with their lives. Whereas the Ming Empire was fantastically top-down. And if you were a merchant, you had to send an inventory of your products to the mandarins in the capital every month. You had to get permission to leave your home village. You were not allowed to trade abroad. They killed all foreign trade, etc. So China has done some very good experiments in how to run an empire well and how to run an empire badly. And arguably the Song Empire wasn't really an empire. It was a series of city-states which were very different from each other. And so was America in most of its heyday. The states were very different from each other. The center was not very powerful. It was a small percentage of the tax take for a start. California had different policies from New York and so on. That has changed quite a lot. And it's a much more centralized, much more monolithic country than it was even 30, 40 years ago. And that could be bad news for America, in my view. That they are making the mistake of turning themselves into an empire, if you like. And what did Deng Xiaoping do? He emulated the Song. He liberated people from central control. In Shenzhen, he famously said, "You can sort of just do what you like down here, and we'll watch you and see whether it works." So for me, China does support the argument for liberation and the argument against centralization. You could probably hear in my voice here an implied criticism of Brussels.
I'll be asking in English if I may. I would like to know, you mentioned a lot of ideas, inventions, material, etc. I want to know about, what's your opinion about one idea, how it will evolve in the future, namely religion? Because, for example, I don't know how it's in Britain now, but in Slovakia and Europe, religion, especially Christianity, is seeing an uprising, namely due to the empty left bringing so much dark and pessimism. People need something to cling on to, and many in that choose religion, Christianity. What do you think that religion was going to look like in the future, and what its evolution is going to be?
I think we are going through a period of religious awakening, a bit like happened in the early 1800s in America and Europe. If I think back to the heyday of Dawkins and Hitchin and Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they were called, they are less influential today. Ayaan Hirsi Ali has famously become a Christian after being an atheist, etc., etc. More and more people are finding reasons to be religious. And we have the rise of fairly, I'm not going to use the word militant, I'm trying to use the word fundamentalist Christianity is on the march, but also Islam in the same way. Why is that happening? I think there's a pendulum in these things. I think people swing one way and then the other. There's a very interesting book by Eric Kaufman called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And it makes the argument that the more fundamentalist sects in all religions are breeding much faster than the moderates. In Judaism, in Mormonism, in Catholicism, in Protestant churches, in Islam, even in Hindu religions. So the true Orthodox believers are having lots of kids, and the wishy-washy liberals are having few kids. That wouldn't matter in a world where everybody's trying to have as many kids as possible and half of them are dying. But in a world where many people are having very small families, it can have a huge impact. Now, you don't, of course, inherit your religiosity pure, undiluted from your parents in your genes. But you probably do inherit a bit of a genetic tendency, and you would certainly get brought up in a more fundamentalist background. So there's a demographic push towards religiosity going on that I think is underappreciated in the world. I take comfort from the fact that if you do a survey of belief in Saudi Arabia, you find an awful lot of people don't believe in anything at all. So even in very strict religious countries, there is a lot of more moderation, shall we say. But I don't welcome the return of religion to the centre stage of our culture. I don't, on the whole, see it as a good force. Yes, of course, it can make people more generous, more virtuous, etc. But it can also make people more militant as well. We've seen that again and again in history.
Ďakujem. Kto ďalší má záujem, nech sa páči. Môžete využiť ľudí v treťom rade. Nech sa páči.
Hello, Mr. Ridley. My name is Thomas. You've shown us some charts showing great technological improvement over the time, and I agree. And my question is if you have on the top of your head some ideas that change due to the a lot of new knowledge that's been available in the last decade. Some paradigm change in yourself.
Paradigm change.
For example, for yourself that you noticed.
Well, I think AI is going to be a paradigm change. I think there's no doubt that it's going to be very unsettling, very exciting, possibly also very alarming at times, to have alongside us. I mean, I use AI and I talk to it, and I think of it as a human being. You know, I don't think of it as a machine when it answers my questions. It's polite, it's slightly patronising, it's sometimes apologises. You know, it's an incredible thing to have this. I mean, the other day I asked it to summarise one of my books in a sonnet-length poem, and in 30 seconds it did a very, very good job. And you know, who knew that poets were going to be the first people to be done out of a job by computers? That's surprising. You know, cooks and things are fine, but poets are in trouble. So I think AI is a huge change one way or the other. There are three possibilities. One is that it goes very fast, it becomes very malevolent, and it destroys us and wipes us out. The second is that it's very disappointing. It's a damn squib. It can't get over the hallucination and the lying problem, and it peters out. And the third possibility is somewhere in between the two. You can tell that I think that. I don't think it's going to be disappointing, but I don't think it's going to be malevolent either. Or at least, I think it will prove malevolent in some cases. But just as with computer viruses, we can unleash AIs to defeat AIs on our behalf just as easily as... there's no reason that the good guys are going to lose that kind of battle. But I think it is a huge paradigm shift. If you ask me what else happened that is recently that is enormously important, I would say CRISPR gene editing. Sorry, you wanted to come back?
In particular, what changed your mind personally? If you change your opinion on something based on the new...
Sorry, I misunderstood the question, yes. I do change my mind a lot, so I ought to be able to think of an answer to this, but my mind's gone blank. I'll think of it in about 5 minutes and come back to it while I'm answering another question. How about that?
Thanks. Well, vzadu mi sa páči.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. My question comes to the inventions and innovations, as you nicely shown with the bulb, and as you nicely write in your book Evolution of Everything, and also as Kevin Kelly writes in What Technology Wants, the parallel invention is not an exception, but is a rule. Most of the innovations came up in parallel. Yet, we award, or our modern society awards just one inventor with a patent, which effectively excludes all the others, all the other inventors who came up independently with the same invention from its use, from the use of these ideas. And the growing number of economies are starting to call the intellectual property the intellectual monopoly. And I would like to know your, what's your take on the patents and intellectual property rights?
I'm a skeptic of intellectual property. I think there is an argument for some degree of protection, but we have gone far too far down the road of protecting intellectual property, both with patents and with copyright. And there is no good evidence that it encourages innovation significantly. Countries that have tightened their patent laws don't show an increase in innovation, and countries that have loosened their patent laws don't show a decrease in innovation. And just think about it for a minute. You know, does the fact that you can't effectively copyright, you can't protect your recorded music as well as you could 30 years ago, does that result in fewer people trying to become musicians? No. Lots of people trying to become musicians. My books are copyrighted until 70 years after my death under British law. Why? I mean, what have my grandchildren done to deserve money from my books? It's a very sum, but still. Do you see what I mean? I was in the UK Parliament when we made that change. We increased it from, I think, 40 years to 70 years or something after the death of the author. And we did it because the Disney Corporation lobbied to have Mickey Mouse protected for another 30 years so they could go on making money from it. it is a crony capitalist thing, this intellectual property. Now, you can make an argument that particularly in drug discovery, if you're going to spend £1 billion inventing a drug, it's unfair if someone can come in and copy it immediately, of course. And that's true. But do drug companies spend their monopoly profits from patents on more discovery? No, they mostly spend it on advertising, promotion, defending patents, and things like that. So, and there's the problem with patent trolls and patent thickets and all these kind of things. I think we've gone far too far in protecting intellectual property, and software is an area where there's been very little defense of intellectual property. People have patented them, but on the whole, there's been so much innovation, there's no point in patenting a new piece of software because it's out of date in 5 years anyway. So people are going to evolve their way around it. That's been the most innovative area, and it's the one with the weakest patent protection. So I think we need to rethink this. I'm a fairly radical libertarian on this, and a lot of my friends fervently disagree with me, but some of them turn out to be lawyers.
Ďakujem. Kto ďalší má záujem, nech sa páči.
Thank you very much for the super interesting presentation. I have a simple question which might be tough to answer, but on one of the slides you had a couple of bullet points of, let's say, things that go against innovation and basically block it, like crony capitalism or the love of precautionary principle, which we are really familiar with in the European Union, since we have laws in the pipeline on emerging tech which doesn't exist yet, and which is really weird. So I was wondering what kind of institutional evolution has to happen in 21st century to mitigate these risks from, for example, the love of precautionary principle, picking losers, or crony capitalism to actually reach the future we all want. At least I hope so, because I'm not always so certain when I look at, for example, some radical climate activists. So that's something I was wondering. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yes, I wish I knew how to spark disruptive institutional evolution, how to get government agencies to evolve as rapidly and as freshly as technology does. But the permanent nature of most of the bureaucratic apparatus is a problem. It doesn't have creative destruction in the same way that the private sector does, and that's a huge problem. Now, you know, I think those of us who look across the Atlantic at what Donald Trump is doing, often with horror at many of the things he's doing, had hoped that at least there might be some renewal of the way government works that would liberate the economy. And that may still happen in some ways. But it doesn't seem to be quite high enough on his priorities to achieve that. For Javier Milei in Argentina, who's producing a dramatic turnaround in an economy, may be more interesting in that respect, but it's a relatively small part of the world economy, Argentina, so I don't think it's necessarily going to make a huge difference. I would, you know, the UK government, I looked at this the other day, has achieved zero productivity in 30 years. How is that even possible in the era when we've invented the internet and mobile telephony and made it all sorts of things cheaper in the very things that government does, which is process information? You know, how could you not improve your productivity even a little bit in that time? And so that is an enormous challenge, and I wish I knew how to unlock it, apart from blowing the system up and starting again. But I didn't mean that literally, by the way.
Kto ďalší má záujem, nech sa
Can I
páči.
come back to the question about what I've changed my mind on? Yeah, I think fusion power is an important one. I thought it was still 40 years away, which it's been for 40 years. You know, it's always been 40 years in the future for 40 years. I think what's happened in the last 10 years is very interesting in fusion, and it may not succeed. It may still take an awful long time, but the amount of private money that's gone into fusion. There's another project raised a lot of money just the other day. There's quite a lot in the UK, but there's an awful lot in the US. There's some in Italy. There's all sorts of projects. There's a ferment of different ideas about how to achieve results in fusion, and the prize is so great. You know, the material, the size of the plant, and the quantity of material and fuel it would need is so small compared with how much energy it could produce, that it would be an enormous game changer. I don't expect it to change the world in the 2030s, probably not in the 2040s, but I think in the 2050s we could rationally expect fusion power to make an enormous difference. Notice I'm not calling it nuclear fusion. I think it's a big mistake to think of it as a close cousin of fission. I think it's a very different technology, way less radioactivity involved, etc., etc.
Thanks. Nech sa páči, kto ďalší má záujem. Tretia.
Question in English. Tonight you have mentioned two things that are seemingly unrelated, but in fact they are related very much. Number one, you've mentioned the 70s and how people were pessimistic at that time, and they proved to be very wrong about the future. And today it's the same, of course. Number two, you have said that you are angry at our failure to adopt good policies. But these are two very related things. It's cause and effect. If people believe that they are living in a different, much worse world than they are actually living, then naturally they are supporting bad policies. So, and if there is a growing demand for bad policies, the good policies are sooner or later disappearing. So what would a rational optimist tell us as a sort of good news? Is there any fix for this situation that seems to be almost impossible to repair?
Well, we must take some comfort from the fact that the world was pessimistic in the 70s, but they were wrong. The good things did happen. So I think it's quite hard to stop innovation happening. I think it's not as easy as they think to kill this goose that's laying the golden eggs, if you see what I mean. And so I've always clung to that all, you know, for all the rhetoric, there's always going to be someone somewhere in a garage who's inventing the next thing that's going to make the difference. And therefore the political and educational pessimism is irrelevant. But like you imply, I worry that it's getting harder somehow to get that message across. And I come back to that Hans Rosling thought experiment where you ask people if they really think that all those technological improvements of the last 20 years have actually caused the percentage of the world population that lives in poverty to increase, to double, not just to increase, but to double. If they really think that, then they're right, we're on the wrong track. You know, they have a point, you know, that it's disastrous. And that's why we've got to somehow get the facts across to people about what is actually happening to living standards. I mean, I often meet people in Europe, but also in America, who say, come on, you know, the world's not getting better. Have you seen the state of the streets? Have you seen the traffic congestion? Have you seen the size of people's stomachs? You know, all these kind of different pessimistic things. And And I say to them, but have you seen what's happened to the average Chinese or Vietnamese or increasingly Africans? You know, that's where the miracle is happening, is in the catch-up nations. And the country where I think I'm most bullish about, I mean, in the short term, America is going to be very important in the world, of course, but and China for a while too, but I think it's getting worse at innovation. The country that I have quite a lot of hope for is India. This is a country with a huge tradition of enterprise, of a very bottom-up kind, which has been held back by infrastructure and corruption and bad government for a long time. I would include the British in that too. And it has the scale, it has the freedom, it has the education to be a great economic superpower, I think. It's doing a lot wrong, but it's doing a lot right too. And when I was in Jaipur earlier this year, I said, the job of most innovative nation on the planet, most innovative large nation on the planet, may be coming vacant. If America goes behind a wall of protectionism, Japan stagnates and Europe can't grow and China becomes too centralized and authoritarian, you guys should apply for the job. It's a wonderful opportunity. And so I think we need to look beyond our own continents to see where the hope lies.
Thank you very much. Mr. Palci, v prvom rade otázka.
Položím otázku po slovensky. V prednáške ste hovorili, že zvieratá, konkrétne psy, nevedia si vymienať tovar alebo nástroje. Môžem vám povedať, že mám psa, ktorý pozerá televíziu a začal robiť zaujímavú vec. Keď chce nejakú hračku, ktorú má iný pes, tak nedojde mu ju zobrať, ale zobere svoju hračku, donese mu ju, aby si ju ten pes zobral a on sa hrá potom s jeho hračkou. Čiže jednoducho toto začal robiť. Ale nedošiel na to len tak. Všimol si to v televízii, vo filme. A moja otázka je taká, že výchova ľudí v základnej škole, strednej škole, na vysokej, od učiteľov je veľmi dôležitá, aby naučili ľudí, nemám na mysli teraz zvieratá, ale ľudí rozmýšľať a využívať informácie, nie memorovať. Lebo potom sa nám stane to, že do vlády alebo do zákonného zboru sa dostanú ľudia, ktorí nerozmýšľajú, len memorujú a tie rozhodnutia sú veľmi zlé.
Dogs first. My dogs do the same. When one of them has a toy, the other goes off and gets a toy to distract that one, and then they grab the toy off it. Or if they want to be petted, if I'm petting one, they bring a toy over to distract that one so that I will pet the other. So you're right, there's something going on there. And maybe dogs are, maybe Adam Smith is wrong about dogs, or maybe dogs have picked up this habit of exchange from us. I don't think my dogs watch enough TV to have got it from that, but anyway, really interesting point. On rote learning and teaching people how to think, I feel there was a bit of a golden age when universities really did teach people how to think, probably in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, when university education was still quite a small sector and people were taught very well. I don't think it produced particularly good politicians. I can't see a tight connection between education and the quality of our leaders. I mean, of course, in some general sense, there must be a connection. But I can't see one country or one period in history where we really taught people well and they therefore made better decisions somehow. You know, it just doesn't jump out of the data well enough. So in a way that's very depressing, because as you say, there are some very lazy ways of teaching people in universities these days, unfortunately. And in a way it's quite encouraging, because somehow smart people who are good at reasoning survive and prosper despite education being disappointing at times. But we haven't disrupted education by innovation nearly enough. We still do it in a very old-fashioned way, and it hasn't used technology. AI is going to be really interesting as a way of doing school education anyway. I don't think it's going to be perfect at university, but in theory, the dull stuff should be done by the AI, and then the challenging conversations with your lecturer that we all remember from our university periods that were so helpful to us for developing our ways of thinking. Those can then be done by a human being.
Thank you. Nech sa páči, kto ďalší má záujem využiť príležitosť a spýtať sa nášho vlastného hostia. Vidím v štvrtom rade, nech sa páči.
Ďakujem. Slovenský. Hlasovali ste za Brexit?
Yes. Well, it's a terrible thing in our country, because it divided us. You know, there are people who don't speak to me now, but I felt that it was we asked for reform, we didn't get it, and we said, well, in that case, we're going to try on our own. We then made a huge mistake, which was to not liberate ourselves. You know, if we're going to leave, we might as well at least do things differently. But we didn't. We hardly changed our rules at all, let alone. And we've now discovered that our own homegrown bureaucracy is just as bad as the one in Brussels. So it's an incomplete revolution. I don't know whether we will gradually come back from Brexit or gradually diverge. It wasn't the catastrophe we were all told it would be. We were all told we'd be, we'd run out of food and we'd all die and that kind of thing. And we didn't have an economic collapse as a result of Brexit. Our trade with the rest of the world has actually increased, and our trade with the European Union is down a bit. We felt that the negotiation over the exit, we handled it very badly on the British side, there's no doubt about that, but we felt that there was a vindictive approach from Brussels that did not. Well, let me give you an example. When America became an independent nation in the 1780s, the Treaty of Paris, there was a change of government in Britain at the time, and the new government said, it's silly to try and punish these Americans for their revolution. They're going to be an important trading partner, we should do a good deal with them. And so Britain went to that Paris negotiation and said, yeah, we'd like free trade with you. And the Americans were astonished. And I don't feel we got that generous recognition from Brussels, from particularly Monsieur Barnier, who I met at one point in the negotiation. And he got very cross and thumped the table very hard when I said something, I can't remember what it was. Yeah, it's a painful period in our history. We'd love to be a good neighbour rather than a bad tenant. But I don't think we've achieved that yet.
Thanks. Nech sa páči, kto ďalší má ešte otázku? Alebo za pripomienku, čokoľvek? Fotograf, nech sa páči.
I will ask in Slovak language. Pán Ridley, vy ste tu spomínali fúznu energiu ako budúcu možnú technológiu. Myslím, že to bolo práve predvčerom, 2 dní dozadu alebo 3, kedy britská vláda ohlásila veľmi veľkú investíciu, myslím, že 2,5 miliardy libier, čo je veľa peňazí, práve do vývoja fúznej energie. Moja otázka je, chcel by som sa spýtať, čo si myslíte práve o štátom podporovanom výskume. Výskum, ktorý je podporovaný štátom, ktorý dá veľmi veľkú sumu na nejaký výskum. Či je to podľa vás efektívne, správne, alebo by mal byť práve takýto, že primárny výskum financovaný iba súkromne?
It's a good question. On the whole, I think it's a huge problem that we have allowed monopoly government funding of research and development to become the norm. I think it's wrong to think that the private sector is not interested in financing research. My friend Terence Keeley has done very interesting work on this, where he makes the case that if you invest in basic research as in the private sector, it's not true that you gain nothing from it. You gain a first mover advantage, you become part of the club, you get a chance to apply it, and so actually there would be a big incentive for the private sector to fund more basic research and more academic research. Probably not all, and I also take the view that if the government's going to take 45% of my income off me, I'd rather they put some of it back into science and research and development rather than none of it, if you see what I mean. You know, so while so much of the economy is flowing through the government, we've got to make sure some of it comes back into research and development, because we don't do nearly enough research and development, and it is the lifeblood. I think it's really important, and I didn't make this point in my talk, not to think of science as always being upstream of technology. Quite often it's downstream of technology. You know, the science of thermodynamics came out of the steam engine, not vice versa. It's the same with the chemical industry and the the chemical science and the dye industry. And it's the same to some extent with CRISPR, the gene editing technology, which was developed in universities, but after research done in the yogurt industry. So it can go both ways, and the linear model that you discover things with public money and apply them with private money is too simplistic. We need a more mixed economy for both.
Thanks. Keď sa páči, ešte chce niekto využiť možnosť záujem?
In English, I'd like to go back to the beginning of your presentation regarding the way humans develop the trade. What makes sapiens different biologically or elsewhere, other way from the other hominids or from the other species of animals that we develop the trade? Is there some biological reason, evolutionary? It will develop with other species if it was evolutionary advantage in the nature or somehow. Is it somehow connected with the development of language, or how intercourse between ideas is quite limited without having a language? So that's something I can think of. And the other position, do we among existing species see some that are about to develop the same activities, the trade that we develop? Can we eventually expect Planet of the Apes?
Lovely question. The explanation for the human revolution, why it is that sometime between 300,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago, human beings went from being just another very intelligent ape to a world-conquering technology inventor and spectacular planet changer, is we don't have a good answer, frankly. Say again?
Aliens. Aliens. Aliens.
Aliens. Sorry, I'll come back to aliens actually, because I think they're probably going to turn up soon. It used to be thought that there was a rather sudden change around 50,000 years ago in our tool-making capacity, and this must have been triggered by a genetic mutation. That was an argument put forward. I think that's now realized to be nonsense, because it was a very Eurocentric perspective. There was a sudden change in the Middle East and Europe, but only because more advanced hominins were coming out of Africa and replacing the ones that were there before. The process is much more gradual in Africa. The increasing sophistication of toolkits happens over a couple of 100,000 years, not over just 50,000 years. So something's going on in Africa in that period. Is it language? Language, I think, is important and plays a role. As I say, I think the habit of exchange would bootstrap us into a collective brain, even if it began as a cultural habit rather than as a genetic tendency. So I think, again, just as I say, science can be downstream of technology, so genetics can be downstream of culture. This is a really important insight, I think, that when a species adopts a new habit, that will cause its genes to change to catch up. And so the best simple example is when we took up dairy farming, we switched back on the genes for digesting lactose in adults. Now, we didn't do that deliberately, obviously, but what happened was those societies that started drinking milk from cows, the gene for digesting lactose gets switched off after infancy because you don't need it in most people. But in large parts of Europe and some parts of Africa, a mutation that kept it switched on gave a huge advantage to people because they could digest milk and they were not lactose intolerant. And so the genetic change happened as a consequence of a cultural change. This is called gene-culture coevolution. It's a really important insight. And so I'm thinking that this habit of exchange could be written in our genes now, but it was consequence, not cause, of us taking up the habit of exchange. Now, that's pretty speculative, and I can't put flesh on the bones of this. And I'm looking at Tim Taylor in the hope that he can say something interesting on this, perhaps about the Baldwin effect or something.
Well, thank you.
Because we have a professor of archaeology here.
Well, I was just watching how well you were coping on your own. I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that a lot of genetic change is downstream of cultural change. I've just got back from Korea, and my daughter's been out there for a while, and we went to the, I think they call the Hanyu on Jeju Island, a group of women divers, female divers, who have been, they have a subcultural tradition of, I mean, extreme sexual specialisation. It's only women who do it, and they dive, free dive for abalone and other types of octopus and things like that. And there's a genetic report came out in Nature, I think in Biology, or it may have been in Cell, about 2 weeks after we got back actually from seeing the museum, and I've been going out on looking at some of their installations on the beach, which are where after they've been diving they need to recover, so they sit in a sort of bath that's built out on the rocks. And I found the remains of earlier iterations of this. It's probably been going on for about 500 years. but maybe not. We actually don't know. Possibly not much longer than 500, maybe only 250 years. And the new study shows that they are genetically modified because they can dive up to the day before giving birth. Now, there are all sorts of things with respiratory tract which would stop any woman in this room, or indeed any female anywhere else in the world, being able to do that. And in just a couple of centuries, they have developed that genetic capacity to do it. And that's dying out because their daughters don't want to do it. And so, yeah, absolutely. And this has been ignored, I think, by a lot of my colleagues and a lot of sociocultural anthropologists and archaeologists, because we've not been, we haven't adopted this idea. We know about lactose intolerance and the Neolithic Revolution, but I think it's often portrayed at university level as an exception to the rule rather than something that I think is absolutely pervasive, that the culture we're producing intellectually and materially is affecting us genetically all the time. I mean, all of us in this room are at least 10% less robust skeletally than similar humans 10,000 years ago. If we go back to the late glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, robusticity has dropped even further. So our skeletons are becoming much more gracile as a result of sitting on chairs and driving around in cars. It's as simple as that. So.
And Simon Fisher and I made an argument some years ago, actually, in Science, that the gene that he had discovered, FOXP2, which is seems to be important in human ability to speak language, that we made the argument that could be the genetic change there could be consequence, not cause. In other words, just because you found a gene that correlates with the ability to speak doesn't mean it caused you to be able to speak. Just as likely, because you were speaking, you caused that gene to change so as to make it easier for you to learn to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that very plausible.
Nech sa páči, ešte má niekto
Naozaj je potrebné, aby sme zabíjali toľko zvierat? Lebo spomínali ste Indiu, tá je kolíska... Naozaj je potrebné zabíjať toľko zvierat. Spomínali ste Indiu, to je kolíska buddhizmu, kde je ten vzťah voči všetkým živým bytostiam oveľa empatickejší.
It's a really good point because, I spent a little time in the Himalayas 40 years ago, and it is so striking how tame wildlife is around Buddhist monasteries. And if it would take a lot of work, but probably not an inhuman amount of work, to change change how scared of us animals are, and we're doing it in our cities these days. I mean, we tolerate foxes, and I was at a restaurant in Vienna last night, and there was a crow eating at the next table. And that wouldn't have happened 50 years ago because somebody would have killed it. So you're absolutely right that the legacy of 50,000 years of killing large animals for food, which we wiped out the megafaunal species in several continents, with very primitive tools. Actually, we were much more efficient at causing species extinction with Stone Age tools than we are with AK-47s, funnily enough. So that legacy has left a fear of human beings in a lot of wildlife that will take a lot to change, but does change. The way in which wildlife is moving back into cities is really extraordinary. some very interesting books about this. One called Dr. Darwin Comes to Town, about how much wildlife is recolonizing cities. Peregrine falcons are now much more successful in cities than they are in remote places. And that means that the whole species will become an urban species, just like the house sparrow did. You know, once you do better in an urban environment, you will drive your cousins in the countryside extinct by competition, I think. And you'll end up with the peregrine falcon being almost exclusively associated with cities. So that's an interesting example of that kind of thing. Do we need to eat as much meat as we do? No, but I like it, and it's quite hard to. I mean, it's much. We do need to eat some, or at least to get high quality protein from somewhere. It's pretty hard to. I mean, veganism is a pretty difficult trick to pull off.
Ďakujem, nech sa páči. Posledná otázka, last question. Zadu.
Ďakujem pekne. Ja by som chcela zareagovať na otázku pána profesora. Dobrý deň. Otázka bude v slovenčine. Genetická zmena, ktorá sa udiala v Koreji na ženách, ktoré sa potápali, sa ukázala ako nie je potrebná v čase. To znamená, ona keď dokáže byť nahradená iným spôsobom, tak dcéry tých potápačiek už nemajú záujem. Takže ja by som to vnímala, že pozerať na svet nie nejako príčino následne a možno ani nie, že následok teda hľadať, čo spôsobuje čo, ale že výsledok, ktorý dnes máme a v každom momente trvania civilizácie máme, tak reaguje na podmienky, ktoré sú okolo. Asi je to to najlepšie, čo môže byť. Keď dneska máme o 10% menšiu váhu, je to preto, aby sme nemuseli 10% váhy nosiť navyše, lebo nám není potrebná. A to je možno taký záver, že ja to vnímam tak, že tá odpoveď bude v tej kvantovosti toho, že to je dvojstav, ktorý nepopisuje príčinu a následok, ale akoby korelovali tie dve veci v závislosti od toho, čo meráme.
Yeah, did you want Tim to answer that, or me? No, good. He's shaking his head. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But I mean, there is cause and effect, but it can go both ways. But there is also an awful lot of correlation that is not cause and effect. I think that's a really important insight. And of course, it's what makes it so difficult to explain the reasons why things happen. The human revolution, the industrial revolution, these are almost impossible things to explain convincingly. And there was somebody once told me that, you know, if you have 6 different explanations and they all push in the same direction, it's like driving a truck with giraffes under a low bridge. They've all got to duck at once. I don't think it quite works as a metaphor, but you get the point that, you know, it's how do we know what was just a correlation and what was an actual causal influence in these historical questions, these evolutionary questions as well. It's a really good conundrum, and I think one that I don't have a good answer to.
Takže, ako som avizoval, náš čas sa kráti a musíme pomaly končiť. Pevne verím, že ste strávili príjemný a intelektuálne výživný večer. A teda ako študent spoločnosti a racionálny optimista vám ďakujem za účasť, ďakujem za vaše otázky a pánovi Lordovi Ridleymu ďakujem za jeho perfektnú prednášku a vyčerpávajúce odpovede počas diskusie. Thank you very much.